What's up, guys, and welcome to my video lecture on the Russian Revolution. Today we're going to be looking at the Russian revolutions of 1905, the revolutions of 1917, both the February and the October revolutions, and the Russian Civil War that have followed immediately thereafter. We'll also be looking at some of the important background information that you need to make sense of all of this. I'm including some video goals for you guys just so you know exactly what you need to get out of this lecture. So I've got key people that you need to know about, key events, key questions, and also just some random fun stuff that you don't need to write down. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So some important background information that you guys need. First of all, is you need to understand kind of the basic policies that Russia had been pursuing for the 50 years or so leading up to the Russian revolutions. Before 1855, Russia had basically not modernized at all. They were more or less still an early modern divine right monarchy, living and trying to compete with living in the modern world, trying to compete with fully industrialized powers like Britain and France. In 1855, Russia suffers a crushing, I think it's like 1853 actually, suffers a crushing defeat at the hands of Britain and France in the Crimean Wars. And they realize that they need to try and modernize. And so what you get in Russia is attempts at top-down, state-led industrialization and modernization. And this begins with Tsar Alexander II, who ruled from 1855 to 1881. He is going to try and bring about the necessary social changes to make industrialization possible. The most important thing that he does is he ends serfdom in Russia. He emancipates the serfs, and he also allows for a limited amount of representative government at the local level. These are the Zemstvos, in which local notables and gentry are allowed to run local government and like fund infrastructure and education and hospitals and stuff like that. These first steps towards modernization are very important. They're not really enough to get Russia caught up. And one reason that Alexander doesn't do more is his reforms actually result in the unanticipated consequence of a whole variety of radical, progressive, anti-government groups coming about. Basically, like Alexander's offering them like a tiny step forward in modernization, and the people of Russia instead demand total, rapid social change, which Alexander is, of course, unwilling to grant them. So towards the end of his life, Alexander actually begins sort of focusing on controlling these radicals rather than continuing modernization. And eventually, in 1881, Alexander is actually assassinated by a series of explosions around his horse-drawn carriage. And so Alexander II, who hoped to totally reform Russia, is really only able to make the first couple important steps. His successor, Alexander III, is very conservative. Basically, he saw what happened to his father's regime, and he decides that he is not going to suffer the same fate. And he tries to rule simply through old-school authoritarian measures. He tries to repress any kind of terrorist or radical progressive movements. And basically, any movement towards modernization stalls out under Alexander III. Now, after Alexander III, Nicholas II, the last of the czars, realizes that this is not the right way and that rapid industrialization and modernization needs to happen if Russia is going to stay relevant. And now, Alexander II actually does end up adopting a number of fairly effective reform measures. Probably most significantly is he is able to forge an alliance with France, in which Russia promises to give France military assistance in exchange for very, very cheap French loans that will be used to fund Russian industrialization. He also has a number of other important reforms, including land reforms, in which land is privatized. And you actually see during his reign fairly substantial uh, increases in industrial production. Uh, this is largely concentrated in Russia's major cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and a handful of others. And these are massive, largely state-funded ironworks and coal mines in which thousands of workers are housed together in barracks in really terrible conditions. So this is very rapid modernization led by the state, and it happens in just a couple of decades. Now, one consequence of this very rapid industrialization and this high concentration of workers in the cities is you start to see a lot of instability. The living conditions in these new factories are absolutely horrible, and these workers who are coming in from the countryside are first generation workers. They're not used to any of this, and this just seems completely ridiculous to them, the way that life is structured here. And unfortunately for the czars, there's already a fairly substantial communist um, uh, presence in the cities. And these workers who are coming in from the countryside, many of them just immediately become communist and anti-czar. So now you have lots of communist workers living in and around Russia's largest city centers, which is not going to work out great for the czar in the long run. Some other important background. We need to look at Russian society in the year 1900 and think about how it was structured. So first of all, one of Russia's main principles, and kind of a main principle in Russian government going all the way back to before the czars, was a principle of autocracy. That is, one person has total, absolute authority. At this point in Russia's history, that is still based on divine right theory. That is the almost, like medieval concept that the king has been chosen by God and that he gets his authority directly from God and not from the people. And the czar's power in Russia is theoretically unlimited, that he can rewrite any law he wants whenever he wants to. Now, practically, the czar's power actually is quite limited. His government bureaucracy is kind of backwards. Roads and communication are quite primitive, so the czar doesn't actually know very much of what's going on in his territory, and the amount of information that he has access to is actually quite limited. And that's why there was actually a saying in Russia that people would whisper this to their friends when they were like breaking the rules or whatever, is that yes, the czar is all powerful, but the czar is also very far away. Meaning that if the czar knew about this, he would shut it down, but he's probably not even going to hear about it. So, second, the Russian economy in 1900 was wildly backwards. Almost 90% of their entire population were peasants. People like this. People who still farmed with wooden implements and still wore felt boots, aka thick socks, rather than actual shoes because they were so impoverished. Russian peasants used more or less medieval techniques of agriculture, and the grain yield of Russian agriculture was a measly 2-to-1. That is, for every one seed you planted, you got two back, which is just wildly inefficient. And this was compared to rates of this was compared to grain yields in Britain and France and the Netherlands that were like 14 or 15 to 1. So Russian agriculture was just way, way less efficient than the countries that Russia was competing against. However, in spite of Russia's relative backwardsness, they were also going through a period of rapid growth. They were trying to industrialize enough to catch up with Germany, France, and Britain in just a couple of decades, largely because they were concerned about possible military conflicts with Western Europe. And this led to the concentration of laborers in cities, and as I already mentioned, created really unstable situations in those cities. These workers, as I already mentioned, were sort of radicalized by the communist presence in the cities, and the peasants were also beginning to demand more and better land. Even though they were no longer serfs, they still had access to usually the worst land in the country, and whereas the wealthy landowners kept the best land for themselves. And with Russia's rising population, the peasants were feeling more and more desperate to somehow have access to better land in order to feed their families and stuff. So Russia is really not in a hot situation. They have an outdated system of government, a backward economy, and are experiencing social unrest both in the countryside among the peasants and in their major cities from the new industrial working class. So things are not looking great. One last important piece of background information is that from the time of Alexander II on, there have been a number of different competing opposition groups within Russia. And they all were opposed to the government in various ways, and they're eventually going to get what they want, which is the overthrow of the Tsarist government. So the first group that we need to look at, and the most powerful group for a long time, was the Progressive Liberals. The Progressive Liberals basically just wanted Russia to be more like Great Britain. They wanted a constitution. They wanted limited voting rights for like wealthier people, and they wanted specific constitutional checks on what the Tsar could or could not do. The Progressive Liberals argued that this was both a moral good, that people just deserved these rights, but also they argued that limiting government and creating a constitution was necessary if Russia was ever going to become a fully industrialized state, because you need property rights and the rule of law before businesses can really, modern business can really take off. A much more extreme group than the Progressive Liberals, and for most of this time period a less powerful group, were the Marxists. And the Marxists were the followers of Karl Marx, and they believed that capitalism was itself an immoral system, and that capitalism needed to be overthrown and replaced with some sort of rule by the workers. And they believed that some sort of revolution would be necessary to achieve this. It's important to recognize that there was a split within the Marxist groups within Russia. There were two groups, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks were actually the people who listened and followed what Karl Marx had written in all of his many books. Specifically, the Mensheviks believed that history moved through a certain series of fixed stages, and that the first stage of relevance is the feudal stage, in which landowning aristocrats rule over peasant farmers, and they believed that this was the stage that Russia was still in. The second stage, following the feudal stage, was capitalism. And capitalism is when pretty much everything in the society is owned by a group of capitalists known as the bourgeoisie, and that the entire rest of the society is reduced to wage workers known as the proletariat. So it's a shift largely from farming and land ownership to wage labor for people who own stuff. That's the big shift from feudalism to capitalism. And the Mensheviks believed that you could not have a communist revolution until you were in the capitalist stage. And that's because, well, for lots of reasons, but one of the main reasons is that Karl Marx believed that the proletariat, the industrial workers, were the only people who could successfully carry out the communist revolution. Karl Marx believed that the proletariat were special, and that they, unlike all other classes in history, would not just immediately oppress other people when they came into power, which is a really kind of a cute idea, I think. And we'll see that the Russian Revolution maybe disproves this idea. Maybe not. It's complicated. So those are the Mensheviks. They are the orthodox Marxists who believe that Russia needs to become capitalist first before they can become communist. And what this means in practice is that the Mensheviks actually support the Progressive Liberals. And these guys, the Mensheviks and the Progressive Liberals, team up in calling for a parliamentary system, constitutional government, and checks on autocracy, because they believe that this is necessary for Russia to move into the capitalist stage, and that this is necessary before the communist revolution can happen. Now, the other group of Marxists are the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks believe that you can just skip capitalism and go straight from feudalism to communism. That there's no reason to sit around and wait as Russia transforms from one unjust system to another unjust system. And these guys are led by Vladimir Lenin. Uh, and so, what Lenin argues is that while Marx was right to say that usually you have to go through capitalism before you can have communism, it is possible, now that we know what communism looks like, supposedly, that you can just skip from feudalism straight to some sort of communism. Basically, what Lenin argues is that an elite group of Marxists could take control of the government and then sort of shepherd the country through the first stages of capitalism and rapidly get to communism with much less suffering and much more quickly. So Lenin is actually basically ignoring one of Marx's central ideas about sort of the fixed stages of history, just so that he can support a more immediate revolutionary activity. And these folks are known as the Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks means the majority or the big group, whereas Mensheviks means the small group. And this is because of a split that happened between the two Marxist factions. However, in fact, the Mensheviks were actually the much larger group. So calling themselves the Bolsheviks was actually kind of a lie, because they were clearly the minority among Marxists in Russia. So those are the two main opposition groups, the progressive liberals and the Marxists. There were a bunch of other important radical groups. There were anarchists, there were populists, people who believed that the peasants should just be allowed to govern themselves. There were nihilists who just wanted to kill everybody in the government and cause social breakdown and see what happened. But they don't really achieve their goals, and they kind of just sow chaos, whereas the progressive liberals and the Marxists are actually both going to get a chance to implement their ideas once the revolution starts. Oops, I kind of already described this entire slide. But let me tell you a little bit more about Lenin. Lenin was himself a revolutionary for pretty much his entire life. His older brother had been involved with a populist radical group and had been plotting an assassination against some important figure, I don't remember who, and had been arrested and killed. And when Lenin's brother was killed by the government, Lenin basically swore revenge, and he himself then became a revolutionary. Lenin joined the Communist Party and quickly rose up through the ranks. And he was quite a skilled writer and a skilled rhetorician, and he was able to emerge as one of the more important Russian communists on the international scene. He wrote a really influential tract about imperialism. I think it's called something like Imperialism as the Last Stage of Capitalism, in which he explains how capitalism has basically forced capitalist countries to begin going in and taking over other countries around the world. And that this was basically the last stage of capitalism, where capitalists try to exploit other people outside of their own country in order to keep the capitalist system in place in their own country, which is really, I think, a pretty interesting analysis. Lenin was a legit political theorist, as well as a great speaker. And as I already mentioned, he believed that basically Karl Marx was wrong about saying that capitalism had to come first before communism, and that if you had a bunch of really committed revolutionaries, you could simply skip capitalism and go straight from feudalism into capitalism, or into communism. And this was important for Lenin because in Russia was nowhere near being a capitalist country. And if you wanted to have a revolution in Russia, you had to make up some kind of new justification for it, because Karl Marx would say that it wasn't possible. Lenin also believed that once a revolution happened in Russia, the revolution would then spread from there around the world. And that once every country had its own communist revolution, they would all be able to work together to bring about some sort of world utopia where nobody exploited anybody anymore. So those are some of Lenin's important ideas. In terms of his personality, he showed really strong dictatorial tendencies, even when all he was doing was running like a communist book club. So anytime anybody disagreed with Lenin at any point, he would not only try and prove them wrong and prove himself right, but he would basically consider that person to be his personal enemy and would try to drive them out of the party and make sure nobody ever talked to them again. And by and large, he was really quite successful at maintaining power for himself, but this was at the cost of exiling numerous intelligent people who just disagreed with him on various policies. And we'll see this same sort of personality trait come up again with Lenin when he's actually in charge of Russia. All right, so let's get to the revolutions. So Russia goes through a series of revolutions, and the first revolution is in 1905. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, Russia enters a war with Japan and is soundly defeated by Japan. This comes as a huge blow to the Russian self-image as an advanced European power, and a lot of people view this as a total disgrace and a total discrediting of the Tsarist government. Of course, racist and social Darwinist ideas were still around at the time, so many Russians who considered themselves to be European thought that this was a total humiliation because they were being beaten by a non-European power. On top of this, and on top of the harsh economic conditions that the war created, there were also terrible conditions for workers in St. Petersburg. The workers were housed in huge barracks and worked in unsafe, unsanitary factory conditions. And as I already mentioned, the peasants were desperate to get more land, and basically they were ready to jump at any opportunity. So the workers in St. Petersburg arranged for a demonstration in 1905 in front of the Winter Palace where the Tsar was living. And the basic idea here was that if only they could talk to the Tsar, they could let the Tsar know how bad things were, and then the Tsar would fix it. This was a common trope in Russia, the idea that the Tsar was actually the good guy and that he was simply being misled by corrupt officials. So if the people could just speak to the Tsar would help them. Instead, the Tsar sends out soldiers and has the soldiers shoot the crowd until the crowd runs away. This angers people across Russia to the point where there is now just kind of a spontaneous nationwide outburst of violence against the government. And in order to get things under control, the Russian government decides to make some concessions. They decide to give some of the revolutionary people what they want in order to restore order. The most important thing that they do is they grant a parliament to the liberals. They say, all right, we recognize that we messed up and we're not making good choices, so let's go ahead and let's introduce a parliament. This parliament is known as the Duma, and there's limited representation in which the wealthier people, men in Russia, are allowed to vote in order to elect representatives. The Duma doesn't actually have very much real power, but it is a step forward that the liberals are pleased with. On top of this concession, though, they continue with brutal repression of other rebelling groups, and they're able to put these groups down. So basically, they appease the liberal elites, and then they continue smashing the poor workers and farmers until they shut up and go home. And with this combination of concessions and repression, they're able to restore order. One last thing that happens during 1905 is you see the emergence of a organization known as the Soviet. And the Soviet is basically a really involved workers' union. And the Soviets are organizations for workers in the major cities of this time, and the major cities of Russia, where workers get together and they, they fight for better working conditions, but they also plan and talk about sort of radical ideas for ways of making life better. And so these Soviets emerge as a result of the revolutions of 1905, and they're going to remain in existence up until 1917, at which point they are going to actually play a key role in overthrowing the entire government. But so anyway, in 1905, the government is able to put the revolution down and to remain in power, and they're able to keep things together for another, 12 years until 1917. So the thing that really screws it up for the Tsars is the outbreak of World War I. As you might recall, Russia had a military agreement with France in order to help France take down Germany. And so in 1914, war breaks out, and Russia mobilizes for war. Russia, on paper, looks like a really powerful opponent. They have the largest number of troops out of any power fighting in the war, but in reality, they are not very threatening. And the reason for this is that their economy is still so far behind the other Western powers that they are basically unable to equip their troops with modern equipment. Um, and simply attempting to supply these troops as they go up against the Germans and the Austrians wrecks the Russian economy. There are shortages on pretty much every basic good. The price of food goes up, the price of fuel goes up, and in some cases, people are left in the middle of the Russian winter unable to get firewood in Russia's major cities. People are just freezing to death in their apartments or burning furniture and like pianos and stuff to keep warm. During this time period, working conditions stay bad and prices are going up, so workers begin to strike and demand better pay. The government responds to this simply by using military repression to keep them working and to put down any strikes that occur. On top of this, Russia is soundly defeated again and again by the much better equipped German army. And all of this is leading to serious lack of trust in the Russian government, and is leading to really unstable conditions that seem like they're going to result in another revolution. On top of all of this, there are some conspiracy theories going around about who is really in charge of the government. One of the Tsar's children suffered from some combination of weird medical ailments, and the Tsarina, that is the wife of the Tsar, believed that she had found a miracle worker who could cure the child. And this is the weirdo monk Rasputin. Rasputin, dressed like a peasant, barely ever washed, had like dirty nails and greasy hair and a beard, and these weird hypnotizing eyes. And the Tsarina was totally obsessed with him. Many people suggested that the Tsarina had a sexual relationship with Rasputin, and that Rasputin had somehow brainwashed the Tsarina into listening to whatever he said. He was invited to all of the Tsar's fancy parties and stuff like that, and whereas you'd have these people wearing like diamonds and silk, he would show up in his dirty robe, dirty hands, eat with his hands, and was just a total weirdo. And so a lot of people were starting to worry that the Tsar had basically lost control of the government and was basically just doing whatever this weirdo monk said. So in short, the World War I basically deprived the Russian government of any of its legitimacy. People were suffering in its cities. It was being defeated out on the front, and there were wild conspiracy theories circulating about this crazy guy at court. And all of this ultimately culminates in a revolt in St. Petersburg, which had been renamed Petrograd to sound more Russian and less German. And this revolt gets to the point where it's clear that the government's not going to be able to restore order, and the Tsar simply gives up. He abdicates in March 1917. So the February Revolution, which broke out, was successful. People from all over the place turned out. They overthrew the government. Soldiers mutinied. The Tsar gave up, and new people were allowed to form a government. This government that's going to be formed is going to be known as the Provisional Government, and it's going to be headed by this guy, Alexander Kerensky. Here he is right here. Hard-working, liberal, progressive guy who's going to try and turn Russia into a modern nation state, a capitalist nation state. And the Provisional Government is going to fail, and we need to look at why the Provisional Government fails. First of all, the Provisional Government has support from a number of the traditional elites who realize that there's really not many better options at this point. It also has support from the liberal progressives, and it also has support from the Mensheviks. Because remember, the Mensheviks think that Russia needs to go through a capitalist phase first before it can have communism. So they're willing to cooperate with the provisional government for now. The Bolsheviks refuse to cooperate. And they begin, instead of working with the government, they begin working in the Soviets and trying to turn the Soviets into basically an alternate system of government in which workers come together and they vote and they make up their own rules. And they also begin to prepare for war. So the Soviets are basically little terrorist cells within Russian society waiting to break out and take over. So so they're committed to overthrowing the provisional government. Now, the Bolsheviks probably wouldn't have been a major threat if it wasn't for the fatal decision of the provisional government to continue fighting in the war. The war was basically what broke the Tsarist government, and I don't really know why the provisional government thought that they could do better. So they have massive pressure from Britain and France to continue fighting Germany, and Russia decides to continue fighting the war. And the war just continues to go terribly, and they continue to suffer all of the same problems that the Tsarist government did. Throughout the summer, things continue to get worse. There is an uprising known as the July Revolution that they're able to put down, but the government is becoming increasingly unpopular. They have to shoot demonstrators, they have to seek out and arrest Bolshevik agitators, and the end of the war is nowhere in sight. So the provisional government is facing a really bleak situation here. And now, when you get into the fall of 1917, you're going to see the final collapse of the provisional government and the rise of the communists. So here's Lenin here. Lenin had been in exile. He had been kicked out of Russia under the Tsars. But he was able to come back in April 1917. The Germans actually found Lenin and shipped him back to Russia because they thought that Lenin might help to knock Russia out of the war, which they were right. And so Lenin has had a lot of time in exile to craft his message. And he crafts his message to be so simple that every single person in every single Russian peasant can understand it. Here's his promise. Here's his platform. He says, peace, land, and bread. We're going to end World War I. We're going to give land to the people who work it. And we are going to have food for us to eat. So when Lenin gets back, he begins to prepare the Soviets for war. And his idea is that he's going to wait for a moment of crisis. And at that moment of crisis, the Soviets are simply going to grab their guns and take control of the major cities in Russia. They're going to take control of palaces and whatnot. And this is exactly what happens. In October, there is a period of extra intense instability, and Lenin decides that this is their shot, this is their opportunity. So Lenin gives the signal, and the Soviets all around the country grab their guns and begin taking over major cities. They're able to seize total control of the city of Petrograd, the capital. Lenin's kind of second-in-command guy is this guy, Leon Trotsky, who had been a journalist living in Brooklyn for a while, but who turned out to be not only a first-rate speaker and theoretician, but also a first-rate military commander. And they are able to seize control of the palace and railway stations and newspaper shops and telegraph stations, and basically turn St. Petersburg or Petrograd into a Soviet city. Soviets around the country do the same thing, seizing control of the key points of infrastructure and basically shutting down the country and seizing control of these key points of power. So they don't have control of the countryside, but they have control over the cities of Russia. They also chase down and execute every member of the Russian royal family that they can find, eventually shooting the Tsar as well. So Lenin has seized power, and these are the reforms that he actually implements. And he really does attempt to implement the reforms that he said in his speech. So first of all, Lenin wants to give all power to the Soviets. That is one of his main ideas. And basically, he thinks that the Soviets could function as a new system of government in Russia. So remember, the Soviets were these workers' groups, and they basically were somewhere between like a union and like some sort of representative government body. And the idea here was that the Soviets would allow for workers to come in and voice their opinions, and that the Soviets could then elect representatives to go to national representative bodies, and that policy would be made there. And so I really think Lenin did actually believe this, at least at first, is that the workers should be allowed to bring forth their own representatives, and eventually they could work towards some kind of workers' democracy. It doesn't actually work out that way, and we'll see why. Lenin also calls for a dictatorship of the proletariat in which, among other things, the factories are actually given over to the people who work in them. So the people who had been simply working on assembly lines and whatnot are now all of a sudden in charge of questions of like production and distribution. So that doesn't really work very well, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. Lenin does follow through on his promise for peace. He immediately reaches out to Germany and fairly quickly signs a treaty known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And basically what happens here is Russia is willing to give up just huge amounts of territory to Germany as long as Germany promises to stop fighting. So they give away like most of Poland and like the Baltic states and stuff like that, and lose a huge chunk of territory. Now, Lenin's not really worried about this because he is 100% convinced that Germany is about to have its own communist revolution, and that it doesn't really matter if Russia gives up some territory, because pretty soon every country in the world is going to be communist and we can all work together, so it doesn't matter who controls whom. That doesn't work out, but it's a nice idea. And last of all, land. Lenin also follows through on this. Lenin basically arrests all of the wealthy landowners, and he just gives land to the peasants who live there. And this is amazing from the peasants' perspective. This is all they've ever really wanted. And when Lenin actually just gives them the land, he immediately wins over the loyalty of the peasants. And the Bolsheviks now not only control the cities, but also have the loyalty of the peasants on the countryside. So that's a major move there. Now, his last thing that he promised, bread. Well, there's still not a lot of bread to go around. But hopefully, Lenin thinks, with peace, eventually there will be plenty of food to go around, and the price of bread should go down soon enough. Unfortunately for Lenin and for world history, that's not what happens. Instead, Russia is faced with a 7-year-long civil war in which the Red Army, that is the Communist Army, is forced to go up against a bunch of czarist or liberal progressive folks who unify together into what is known as the White Army. And this civil war is going to tear apart Russia, which was already in terrible shape. Let's talk a little bit more about the White Army first. So the White Army was not really highly unified. The only thing that held them together is they did not want communism. So it was kind of a random mushing together of various people, an alliance, that's the word, an alliance of various different groups who didn't want communists. So these were people who supported the Tsar, people who supported Alexander Kerensky, and they were funded and supplied largely by the capitalist powers of Western Europe and the United States. The United States famously helped to support a White Army expedition up here in the northern port city of Arkhangelsk. The White Army is not very effective. They are kind of fragmented and attacking Russia from different directions. They have a hard time coordinating their movements, and there's power struggles within the White Army because the only thing they can really agree on is that they don't like the Russians, but they don't necessarily agree on what the ultimate goal of the war is or anything like that. Not the Russians, the communists. Now, the Red Army, on the other hand, is highly unified. The soldiers in the Red Army are deeply committed to the ideas of communism, And Lenin has basically total control over the Soviets and strategic decision making. And they are led by the highly talented Leon Trotsky, who has a armored train where he just drives around to different fronts, overseeing the troops and commanding and stuff like that. One thing that makes it really easy for the Red Army to defend is they have internal lines of defense, which means that they have all their supplies and men in the middle, so they can just bop over here and fight a battle, and then load up on trains and go over here and fight a battle over here. Whereas the White Army has a much harder time coordinating its people and getting supplies where they need to be. So this war rages for about 7 years, and it is brutal. The Red Army has some significant advantages, but they really have to pull out all the stops in order to come out victorious here. Russia is really taking just a huge beating in this war. They lost millions of people in World War I, and they're going to lose another 3 million people during the Russian Civil War. There's barely enough food to go around, and there's a huge shortage of industrial production. Most of it has to go to the war, so there's very little stuff left over for the civilian population. As a result of the Civil War, Lenin is forced to adopt a new policy. He had beforehand basically been happy to let workers run their own factories and let peasants run their own farms, at least for now. But because of the incredible cost of the war, Lenin realizes that he's going to have to figure out a way to boost production in order to get what he needs. So obviously, if you put workers in charge of their own factory, they're going to produce less stuff, or they might not produce what you need them to produce. And so basically what Lenin does is he puts his own boys from the Bolsheviks, from the Communist Party, in charge of these factories. And they basically tell the workers what they have to do, and if the workers don't do it, then they get shot. So that's kind of the opposite of what the communists had wanted, but that's what they need to do to win this war. Same thing goes for farmers. The farmers don't really want to sell the food they're growing to the Russians because the money during this time period is really unstable. However, the Red Army needs this food in order to win the war. So what they basically start doing is they send around squads of soldiers to just hold up the peasants at gunpoint until the peasants give them the food that they need. So basically, instead of a system in which factory workers and farmers were in control of their own lives, instead it becomes kind of a dictatorship in which people are forced to work or threatened to be shot. So that is one of the important consequences of the Russian Civil War. This is known as war communism, and it is a major problem for the Soviet Union. And in many ways, it's going to lay the groundwork for Stalinism, in which you boost production by simply forcing the population to do what you need them to do, possibly at gunpoint. So, one last thing. So that's all the main stuff, but I forgot to tell you about one more bonus fun thing, which is the Green Army. So the Red Army and the White Army were both super unpopular. The Red Army was unpopular because war communism was basically holding the whole country hostage, and the White Army was unpopular because they wanted to put the Tsar back in charge, or some other really unpopular government. And so most people in Russia, especially most peasants, hated both sides, and they decided in some cases to form their own army known as the Green Army, which was just a bunch of peasants who just shot at the Red Army and the White Army. And they just told everybody to leave the peasants alone because the peasants were fine on their own and they didn't need help from either side, thank you very much. So that was the Green Army, and I always thought that that was kind of fun. They didn't win. They were crushed by the Red Army eventually, but I can really respect those Green Army folks for basically standing up for their own rights. Anyway, so those are the video goals. I hope you enjoyed the video lecture. I know it's not as fun as in real life, but hey, what are you going to do? Everybody stay healthy. Have a good time. I'll see you later.